Science and Technology. I'm Matt Brown, the director of the center. Our speaker today is Adolph Reed Jr., Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania in political science. Professor Reed is one of the leading thinkers today on race and politics in the United States, and he's known for his insistence that the analyses of racial oppression and inequality need to be understood in the background of a larger understanding of class and class inequality and economic inequality. His achievements and accomplishments are really too many to name. He's a major public intellectual, activist and organizer, founding member of the U.S. Labor Party, among many other things. And he has a new book, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. It's just come out through Verso, which I think we're going to have a few copies of for sale after the lecture. So you'll be able to pick it up afterwards. So without further ado, please welcome Adolph Reed.
Hi, thank you very much for the flattering intro. I'm really happy to be here. I mean, this is like one of the most important topics I think that confronts us, like in the U.S. or in American politics today, how to think about race and associated issues. And I hope we can have some discussion. And so, without further ado, I'm going to start by just trying to, lay out a handful of grounding contentions. We call them aphorisms, even. Like, first, what is race? Right, ultimately. Well, race is a discourse of ascriptive difference. That is, difference based on what people cluster together as a population supposedly are, rather than what they do. Such populations are, you know what, I forgot to do this. I'm taking my watch off to try to time myself, because saying one of the deadliest things that a professor, or even the former professor, can say is, I'm going to try to be brief. And I'll try to hold myself to it. Such populations are constructed through social, ideological, and political economic processes. They are not given, that is, or natural populations. They emerge from folk knowledge, those things we know to be true because we know them to be true. They make sense of the world around us by explaining why things are what they seem to be. So in that sense, they're just so stories, right? And I'll mention a couple of them that seem either comparatively harmless or comparatively trivial or absurd. But 3 years ago, like when I was a kid, a preschooler and high school, there was a wisdom about track and field that black people could run sprints. Why? Well, we're evolved, we're physically adapted to running or to being good sprinters. And the arguments for this had to do with the claim that blacks had an extra thigh muscle that gave them special takeoff power, or that they had a flattened and elongated heel, which also helped them to stay balanced. Well, of course, both those things were bogus, right? There was no extra heel, or rather, there was no extra thigh muscle. Even among people who were understood to be black, and heel character varies across Homo sapiens sapiens randomly, right? And the flip side of that wisdom was that African descended people couldn't run long distances because they lacked the stamina. Well, then came decolonization. And a baby Bikilo from Ethiopia won the marathon barefoot in 1960, and then he won the marathon with shoes on in 1964. And Kenya and East Africa and the Horn of Africa have been dominant in long distance running ever since, to the extent that by the mid-90s, there was an equal and opposite stereotype that East Africans somehow had evolved biologically to be long-distance runners, right? Anyway, I don't want to go off on too many of the digressions like this, but race, of course, is not the only such category of descriptive difference. There are many, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment too. They are especially significant in hierarchical societies because what discourses of ascriptive difference typically do, what appeals about them, and underwrites their staying power, as it were, is that they legitimize an existing hierarchical social order by telling us that everybody's where they deserve to be, by nature or by merit or whatever. So they are, again, just so stories that explain how and why everybody in society is where they belong. And when those discourses converge with and reinforce the interests of powerful strata in a society, then that's when they're more likely really to have your staying power, to be imposed by law and custom instead of just common sense. But it's important to stress, though, that those populations, the populations who get constructed as these groups, or the natural groupings, are created. Again, they're not born, they're not given. In the racial adaptability chart, which I'm going to talk about a little more later, is very nice an illustration, I think, but also a very recent, or comparatively recent instance of this is a book by an anthropologist named Lee Benford called Tomorrow We're All Going to the Harvest. That's a study of an Ontario guest worker program, right? That the province of Ontario maintains with one state in Mexico and Jamaica. And there's a regular migration back and forth among workers from those two places to southern Ontario, where most of the fruits and produce for the country are grown. And I mention that because one of the things that Benford finds is that the growers have figured out a way to distinguish the capabilities of the Mexican and the Jamaican workers, which basically bears on race. And I think a little later I want to kind of push a distinction between race as biology and race as culture, and I want to push that distinction off the cliff because they're both the same thing. But what the growers in southern Ontario argue is that Mexicans, and how cliche is this, are better adapted for stoop labor, right? Picking crops that grow out of the ground. And the Jamaicans are better adapted for picking stuff from trees. That they probably didn't have to stay up very late to get that one together. But the other one is that the Mexican workers are more tractable and more dependable as workers. They're less likely to run away, right, or to do whatever, than the Jamaicans are. And of course, it doesn't enter the growers' minds that, well, English, along with French, of course, but especially in Ontario, people speak English, the Mexican workers don't, the Jamaicans do. But also there's a very large population of Jamaicans already in Ontario. So if you want to, default on the contract or just go get drunk for a weekend, it's a lot easier for a Jamaican to think of that as something to do than it is for a Mexican. But the groupist in interpretation is what the growers go for, and that just kind of speaks, as does the racial adaptability chart, to the common sensicality of the race idea. Now we all know other categories of ascriptive group difference. Gender is one of the most familiar ones to us. It does exactly the same work that race does. And if there's an economist in the room, he or she would probably appreciate this, but I've often referred to race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, and these other categories as points on a single curve of a difference. They're all different, but each one of them is a differently inflected expression of the same phenomenon. Of Justo stories, which attribute to populations the definitive characteristics that justify their comparatively fixed positions within a prevailing social order. There are and have been other such discourses or ideologies. Of course, the dichotomy of civilized and savage is a hoary one. During the early 20th century, those diagnosed as feeble-minded or as natural-born criminals were the equivalent of a race-like group. And near the end of that century, sex offenders and the undercuts also bore the features of that sort of group. So I want to say a little bit about where race came from, right? Race emerged historically along with the institution of slavery in the New World. That's probably not news to anybody in this room. A rich scholarship examines its emergence, perhaps most signally with respect to North America, in Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and Kathleen Brown's great book, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs. You need to read that, just for the title. Both focus on the simultaneous sharpening of distinctions between slavery and indentured servitude and the institutional establishment of black and white, or African and English, as distinct, mutually exclusive status categories over the course of the 17th century in colonial Virginia. Race and racism took shape as an ideology and a material reality during the following century, initially in the context of the contest between free and slave labor systems and the related class struggle that eventually produced the modern notion of free labor as the absolute control of the worker over her person. After defeat of the Confederate insurrection led to slavery's abolition, race as white supremacy evolved in the South as an element in the struggle over what freedom was to mean and how it would be harmonized with the plantocracy's desired labor system and the social order that was required to maintain it. That struggle culminated in the planter-dominated ruling class's victory, which was consolidated in a racialized racialized disfranchisement and the imposition of the codified white supremacist regime of racial segregation, or Jim Crow. In the latter half of the 19th century, the West Coast fights over importation of Chinese labor and Japanese immigration also condensed around racialist ideologies. Railroad operators, miners, and other importers of Chinese labor imagined that Chinese workers' distinctive racial characteristics made them more tractable and capable of living on less than white Americans, who then, by the way, were most commonly described as Native Americans. And opponents of importation argued, therefore, that those very racial characteristics would degrade American labor, and that Chinese were racially unassimilable, as the term of art went at the time. Post-bellum, Southern planters imported Chinese to the Mississippi Delta to compete with black sharecroppers out of the same racialist presumptions of greater tractability, as did later importers of Sicilian labor to the sugar, cane, and cotton fields. Now, large large-scale industrial production in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and depended on mass labor immigration, mainly from the eastern and southern fringes of Europe. The innovations of race science, that is of racialist folk ideology transformed into an academic profession, promised to assist employers' needs for rational labor force management and were present in the foundation of the fields of industrial relations and industrial psychology. Hugo Münsterberg, a founding luminary of industrial psychology, included race psychological diagnosis as an element in assessment of employees' capabilities. Although he stressed that racial or national temperaments are averages and that there is considerable individual variation within groups. He argued that assessment, therefore, should be leavened with consideration of individuals' characteristics and that the influence of group psychology would be significant. Only if the employment not of a single person, but of a large number, is in question, as it is most probable that the average character will show itself in a sufficient degree as soon as many members of the group are selected. But you get the drift. So scholarship on race science and its kissing cousin eugenics has shown the research that sets out to find evidence of racial difference will find it whether or not it exists. Thus, race science produced increasingly refined taxonomies of racial groups, up to as many as 63 basic races. And I point to the chart again. Race means something entirely different from the 3 to 4 to 5 basic flavors of race that we all grew up with. Like you couldn't swing a dead cat without by them hitting a different race groups then. Excuse me. The apparent specificity of race theorists' just so stories about differential racial capacities provided rationales for immigration restriction, sterilization, segregation, the promise and other regimes of inequality. It also held out the promise of assisting employers in assigning workers to jobs for which they were racially suited. And this takes us directly back to the adaptability chart. We can see that this chart was developed by a Pittsburgh industrial relations firm in the mid-1920s. Maps 36 different racial groups' capacities for 22 distinct jobs, 8 different atmospheric conditions, jobs requiring speed or precision, and a day or night shift work. For example, lets were supposedly fair with pick and shovel and concrete and wheelbarrow, bad as hod carriers, cleaners, and caretakers, and Boilermakers helpers, excuse me, good as coal passers and blacksmiths, as well as at jobs requiring speed or precision, and good in cool and dry, smoky or dusty conditions, fair and oily or dirty processes, and good on both day and night shifts. Now, of course, this is all bogus, right? But it's easy to convince oneself that what you imagine is real. I mean, as I was saying before we came in here, that Poles became steel workers in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Gary, and Chicago, not because of any natural aptitude or affinity, but because employers and labor recruiters sorted them into work in steel mills. So this is like an illustration of how populations are constructed, right? And into ascriptive groups. And what I'd like to draw attention to, like in this context, is the distinction between categories and groups, right? So how this process of group construction happens, like at least under, from the sway of scientific race theory forward, right, is you take a category out of a census, for instance, and people who filled out or had filled out for them connection with an ethnic group identity, right, get kind of lumped together as a group, and then characteristics are like imported right into what's really, nothing more than raw census numbers, right, to turn the category right into a group. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. I'll take that as a yes. All right. So now, most Americans have an intuitive sense that they know what race is and how to assign people to different racial groups. Whether or not they believe that racially defined populations are fundamentally unequal, or that racial difference is related to difference in social worth, they feel confident that racial categories reflect something like natural patterns of human classification, and that they understand and can recognize how racial populations differ. On probing, though, the confidence evaporates. When asked to explain what race is, most people hem and haw a bit and then offer vague formulations that blend biology, culture, and stereotypes. Moreover, these notions are almost always incoherent fragments that depend on a thin common sense that originates in the large race theories that emerged in the 18th century and took their familiar structure in the 19th century. They recycle such old chestnuts as the idea that descent from a common, remotely ancestral population creates commonalities of physical appearance and often the vague, almost mystical notion of shared blood that translate into permanent commonalities of culture and affinities of feeling or character among the descendants, even over many centuries, and across very different societies. And the notion of an African diaspora, what we today, is only one politically charged expression of that much more common sensibility. Often these views treat race, nationality, and culture like interchangeably, and they should, because they are ultimately. But one sort of going liberal misconception to clear up, and maybe we can talk about this, is the distinction between race as a category of culture and race as a category of biology. There is not, and never has been, any such difference, right? That the commitment to the race idea is a priori any kind of explanation, right? Like that. It's an ontological commitment, right? It's a commitment to belief in fundamental human differences, defined by these putative groups. Biology or culture is like, I wouldn't say it's like the cover story, but it's like the fluid explanatory metaphor, right? And that's one of the reasons that we've never really been able to defeat the idea, right? Because people are committed to it a priori, right? Prior to any kind of experience whatsoever. But most people no longer actively argue for elaborate views about fundamental racial difference, such as those held by the early race scientists, and commitment to the notion that races are fundamentally unequal has receded. As is often the case with discarded social theories, though, facets of those race theories survive as common sense precepts, long after they've lost credibility as science or public norms of belief. They continue to shape people's everyday understandings, the mental maps with which we make sense of the world around us and our places in it. Even though most of us may understand formally that they are false, or at least improper or socially inappropriate. Around the turn of the current century, for example, calls to see calls to recognize a multiracial identity attest to the residual power of the old racial theories. But the multi-race notion, after all, emerged from efforts to undermine existing racial categories. It was typically linked to an explicitly and self-consciously anti-racist perspective. But in assuming that blending racial backgrounds creates new particular identities, the multi-race idea hovers between biology and culture in a way that reproduces the racialist notions linking race, to character, etc. I think what I'd like to do now is jump over much of the rest of my presentation, and because I've got a punchline that I want to get to, and it's a punchline that's more directly pertinent. But like if this were a 3-hour seminar, I would in full German professor mode, I'd inflict the whole thing on you. But so here's where I'm trying to go here. Some of you may know, I expect some of the DSA people, if no one else, that I've written about wrong-headed and a potentially counterproductive focus on group disparities, most recently about around COVID. About other stuff too, and actually we're talking a little bit just before the talk about some of the how disparities discourse around COVID has actually played out, and I mean the mischief that it opened to. But I'm going to conclude with another moment, I guess, or with discussing another domain in which what I've called race reductionism, follow my son who's a historian, is counterproductive. And this is drawn from a book chapter I just drafted titled "The Farce This Time, Race Reductionism as Class New Mythology from the Solid South to Neoliberal Anti-Racism." This excerpt explores the sources of economic inequality in New Orleans in light of arguments asserting in the wake of the 2017 controversy over removal of Confederate monuments in the city, that persistence of white supremacy is the ultimate source of objectionable inequalities. So, after noting that New Orleans has, of course, been a starkly unequal city economically for for a long time. It's become even more so since Hurricane Katrina, and in those years it's become one of the very most unequal cities in the U.S. And beginning with Katrina, right? I mean, the imagery projected around the world in the aftermath of the hurricane, it presented a stark picture of throngs of people in great disproportion black, stranded and seemingly abandoned in the Superdome and Convention Center and on overpasses and rooftops. Hegemonic racial liberalism has trained Americans' perceptions to recognize race as a presumptive shorthand for a position in society separate from political economy. And those stark images, therefore, have fueled a knee-jerk impression that black people generically in the city, first of all, have been consigned to poverty and vulnerability, and then have been abandoned in a catastrophe based on their race. Passive voice conveniently sidestepped the issue of agency, that is, which individuals, institutions, and social forces were to be considered responsible for the consigning and the abandoning, and thereby enabled expression of the sort of phatic outrage characteristic of mass-mediated moral panics. Moreover, because under the white supremacist order of the 19th century and early 20th century, racial inequality derived more, well, first half of the 20th century, pardon, first two-thirds of the 20th century. Racial inequality derived more directly and explicitly from discrimination and suppression. The arresting imagery easily accommodated, even called forth the lament that the images made it seem as though nothing has changed. And I think this is like a trope that everyone in the room has heard at some point in the last 15 years. Of course, much has changed. Indeed, the reflex to extrapolate from those images representing Katrina's racially disparate impact and the apparent racial neglect in its aftermath to assert that with respect to inequality in the city, race/racism is really the same thing, remains as potent a force in determining and limiting black people's lives now as in 1905, was understandable, especially in light of the interpretive focus of dominant anti-racist discourse. Nevertheless, that perception is inadequate and counterproductive in two respects. First, as I've argued repeatedly, the charge that manifest inequalities derive most consequentially from racism does not help us understand their proximate causation, how individuals or populations become and remain poor. Just to adduce racism or white supremacy. I guess I should cross myself the other way of that. But it is kind of like saying the devil did it, right? There's no implicit theory of causation. Second, even Katrina's racially disparate impact is more complicated than a race reductionist narrative would imply. The geographer Richard Campanella reported 2 years after the storm that blacks were 67% of the city's pre-Katrina population and 76% of those displaced. And whites were 28% of the pre-catastrophe population and 20% of the displaced. So blacks and whites were displaced at rates not radically out of line with their percentages in the overall population. Campanella also found that 66% of deaths from Katrina were black and 31% were white. That very much in line with these groups' percentage in the parish population. And in subsequent work, a year or two after that, confirmed Campanella's findings. Now, surviving the flood was only the first problem facing those whom Katrina displaced. Duration of displacement and quality of life under it were major issues, as was the ability to return to the city. Access to resources have much to do with who evacuated the city when and under what conditions, as well as the destinations where they landed and the circumstances to which they had to adapt. As scholars Shirley Laska and Betty Hearn Morrow indicate, for the most part, the recovery in the U.S. takes place in the market economy, where people are expected to use their own resources, including insurance and savings, to recover. End quote. And they amplify this point by showing that an empirical analysis of property tax data over the 3-year period after Hurricane Andrew in Florida revealed that the majority black and non-Cuban Hispanic neighborhoods recovered at a slower rate than Anglo or Cuban Hispanic neighborhoods. Similarly, low-income neighborhoods, irrespective of race or ethnicity, recovered at a lower rate. There is some evidence that working class or modest income homeowners have a particularly difficult time recovering, as they are likely to experience problems getting insurance payouts, tend to be victimized by fraudulent contractors, and have little, if any, cash reserves to use to repair their homes, end quote. So that all makes common sense, right, for people who live in the world and stop and think about it, right, just a little bit. You know, that would have been a straightforward, commonsensical explanation for the apparent racial disparities evoked through media images and commentary, but a priori commitment to racial interpretation clouds both scholarly and popular understanding and underwrites analytical approaches that confound race and class in explanatory categories. For instance, in December 12, 2005, Los Angeles Times investigative report, which was based on tranches of scholarship, follows a tendency among scholarly researchers to posit white and middle class and poor blacks in a juxtaposition as a key conceptual units for comparison. So white becomes middle class, and black stands in for poor. But that formulation simultaneously treats race as a proxy for class and class as a proxy for race, right? And especially in a context in which racism is already the default explanation for inequality, it effectively stacks the deck, or the formulation effectively stacks the deck in favor of finding racial causation. And this heads I win, tails you lose approach to interpretation is not necessarily disingenuous. It merely presumes hegemonic race and reductionism and reinforces it with the mantle of expert knowledge. Now, it's difficult to distinguish the extent to which individuals chose not to return after Katrina or were unable to do so, and even for those making the decision themselves. But due to whatever mix of volition and constraint, blacks moved back to the city within the first year or so, or first year or two, at a significantly lower rate than whites, although they continued over time to return at a steadier pace than whites did. From a simplistic race reductionist perspective, that could seem to constitute evidence of the causal force of racism. But careful research discloses a more nuanced picture. Facile et al. Conclude that, quote, the race of individuals was not the overriding factor in determining why black residents were less likely to return during the first year after Hurricane Katrina. Rather, blacks were less likely to return to New Orleans because they experienced higher rates of severe housing damage. Similarly, Professor Jonathan Springfield found that while identifying as black African American was a strong predictor of non-return, other characteristics demonstrating vulnerability greatly detracted from the predictive power of this relationship. Specifically, while the disproportionate effect of vulnerability is undeniable, characteristics relating to class, socioeconomic status, and household structure are equally strong predictors of displacement. What has been considered a dynamic of black and white populations in the post-impact environment may be far too broad for the realities of who can and is willing to return to their pre-Katrina residences. Springfield also asks, is the relationship in the vulnerability moderators really a measure of vulnerability, or is it a simple matter of one's economic well-being? And Springfield at least implicitly acknowledges the heads I win, tails you lose formulations that confound race and class, and notes that it is highly likely poor white populations may have just as diminished facilities to return as poor black African-American populations. And a cursory examination of employment and wage dynamics makes clear that there is a significant enough population of poor and economically precarious white people in the city. And these are the last couple sets of numbers I'm going to toss at you. But with respect to economic inequality in New Orleans, patterns of employment and income in the hotel and full-service restaurant industries show both why the nothing has changed narrative is wrong and counterproductive, and why focus on simple disparities is not adequate. Blacks made up 57% of those employed in hotel industry, which accounted for just under 6% of the city's workforce, and 29% of hotel workers were white. But 3/4 of the hotel jobs provided median hourly earnings of under $15. Right? Blacks held 55% of those low-wage jobs. The percentage that's marginally lower than the black share in the city's labor force. Whites held 31%, a percentage slightly lower than the white share of the labor force. By contrast, whites held 52% of jobs in that industry that paid more than $15 an hour, the 10 highest paying occupations, in fact, and blacks held 38%. So whites were overrepresented statistically in more highly paid hotel occupations, but blacks held nearly 2/5 of those jobs. Similarly, in the full-service restaurant industry, which accounted for an additional 7% of the city's employment, 93% of all workers were in occupations that paid less than a median wage of $15 an hour. Whites held 47% of those low-wage jobs, blacks held 40%. In the very small number of highly paid jobs, whites outnumbered blacks in each of the 10 most highly paid occupations that provided median hourly wages that range from $29 plus to $85 plus. And whites outnumbered blacks by the ratios of between 2-to-1 and 5-to-1. However, total employment in those occupations is very small. And while significantly underrepresented in relation to percentages in the labor force and the overall population, blacks are not flatly excluded from those highly paid occupations, which they, in fact, would have been under the segregationist order. But in addition to challenging the nothing has changed narrative, these employment patterns in the hotel and full-service restaurant industries also show what is problematic about a focus on group disparities as the definitive standard of even racial equality and of social justice. In both those industries, the clearest patterns of racial disparity are in the more highly paid occupations, which account for the relatively small shares of industry employment. Addressing those disparities is unobjectionable as a goal, especially in line with the ideal of equality of opportunity, or what Preston Smith has called racial democracy. But that pursuit would do little to redress economic insecurity among black New Orleanians writ large, which results most immediately from a labor market skewed sharply toward low wage and precarious employment, a shriveled system of public goods provision, and public support for rent-intensifying redevelopment that exacerbates the crisis of affordable housing. Substantially increasing wages, say to a minimum of at least $20 an hour, of the 93% of restaurant industry workers, black and non-black, who currently earn less than $15 an hour. Along with unionization and provision of secure pensions and the benefits, would do considerably more to improve the material situation of black New Orleanians than would realizing racial parity in those higher wage occupations. That account for only 7% of the industry's workforce. The same applies to the relative impact of eliminating the less significant racial disparities in more highly paid 25% of hotel industry jobs versus raising wages and benefits and improving working conditions for the 75% of jobs that pay less than $15 an hour. So this distinction underscores the core argument that Walter Ben Michaels and I make in Trouble with Disparity, and I'm quoting this. Not only will a focus on the effort to eliminate racial disparities not take us in the direction of a more equal society, it isn't even the best way of eliminating racial disparities themselves. If the objective is to eliminate black poverty rather than simply to benefit the upper classes, as a focus on closing the so-called wealth gap, which exists, I want to say this every place I'm being recorded, which exists only among the richest 10% of blacks and the richest 10% of whites. We believe the diagnosis of racism as a cause is wrong, and the cure of anti-racism won't work. Racism isn't what principally produces our inequality, and anti-racism won't eliminate it. And because racism is not the principal source of inequality today, anti-racism functions more as a misdirection that justifies inequality than as a strategy for eliminating it. Thank you. Questions, comments? Can we take a few extra minutes, or?
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. That's great. And just a note to the audience at home on YouTube Live, we are also taking questions. You do have to be subscribed to the channel to ask a question. It's an anti-spam kind of thing. So, but please, does anybody have a question for us?
Yes. So though race may be a social construct, it is nonetheless something that has been used to drive wedges and found class solidarity in the past for efforts like what you're talking about with unionization stuff, and the Congress of Industrial Organization's efforts to unionize black workers in the South comes to mind. And so any efforts to achieve changes like that would have to...
Oh, I guess I have to keep this on.
Would have to overcome...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you gotta have that voice in my pocket.
So, what would you recommend to prevent those from becoming wedges that confound working class movements like what you're describing?
Well, a couple of things, right? One is like the idea of focusing on talking to working people about matters of shared concern, right? In 2019, when I was working in the Sanders campaign, I did a union trip to South Carolina. And at a steelworkers hall in Georgetown, there were a couple of white rank and filers there who commented. And one guy was an older guy who was just a stone trump. He was like straight out of animal farm. All he could say was, bring back manufacturing jobs, but get rid of illegal immigrants. And it's over and over and over. It's kind of fascinating to watch. But the other guy, about 40, and it seemed like a decent guy. And he said that he kind of likely read in Sanders' economic program and generally like what he considered Democrats' economic policies. But he said he couldn't understand why they kept getting caught up or letting themselves get caught up in what he called the moral issues. So I probed him a little bit to see what he meant. And, you know, it's like the standard stuff. It's like same-sex marriage, abortion. So we talked about it, and I tried, you know, the pluralist, let's agree to disagree thing. But, that wasn't effective. But so the finance said, well, tell me this. When you get down to it, right, what's more important to you? That you have access to quality health care coverage and rights on the job and a decent wage and a pension, or that no woman ever can have an abortion, or that no two people of the same sex can marry, right? Because one of my senses about this is that the liberals have in their trying to think of the right word because to say it's a retreat just seems too weak. In their haste to get away from class and political economy, right? It's like the Clintonite Schumer, Pelosi, Biden wing of the Democratic Party that until the fascists were about to stage a coup, they were all prepared to say, no, like, don't pay attention to economic inequality, and what they had to offer poor working people was, it was a pretty weak coding class and tutelage and how to shop efficiently. But so what I'm trying to say there is that, like, we're entering a plane for we, to be clear. Those are people who would like to reform and transform the society in a more egalitarian direction. Take that are like in a position where, like, we're operating on a whole because what has been understood to be liberalism and the left in the U.S. for the last 30 years, if not longer, has conceded class and political economy, right? So it's kind of like, and this is what I've said to my friends at the DSA and elsewhere. I think we have to approach this like we're at the beginning of an organizing campaign, right? Like it's not a matter of trying to mobilize the troops we have out there, because we have no troops, right? We're at a point where hell, we're just trying to build a committee, right? I mean, for organizing is going to come down the road. And I think what that means, there's some kind of emancipating about it in a way, but what that means is the real task, right? Isn't to stay up all night following the clickbait, but to help the first black woman get on the Supreme Court, or like even in our vehicle, right? Like the real task is to start trying to connect with other working people, right? And I don't know if you guys, I'll make a plug now for everybody. The Douglas Institute has a podcast we're calling Class Matters podcast. We've done 3 episodes so far, and the tagline for our podcast is, what would the country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? And this is what we discussed like in the issue. And 4th will be coming out soon. But I mean, that's the point, right? Like there are a lot of needs now, obviously. But the most important need, I think, for people who have that kind of vision of egalitarian social transformation is to start trying to root a movement within the working class. And the reason the podcast popped in my mind is that on the first episode, one of the things we discussed was how we define the working class. And I think broadly considered, I've always done this, and this is what we did in the Labor Party too, that people who have to or are expected to work for a living, but except rich PMC types, are the working classes, right? So, but I mean that's easy. We don't need Marxist sociologists to stay up all night trying to parse who belongs to the working class and doesn't. In fact, I don't know if we even do much of it. But I hope that gets at it, right?
Your mic is falling off.
Oh.
On the side there, I think it's gonna.
Oh my God.
Get a little noisy. So.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Wow, it's in the sleeve? How'd that happen? Yeah, Jesus Christ, thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
But wait. I'm sorry, I need to draw a timeline. But the main thing is that they talk to working people about matters of shared concern. And see, one of the problems with this anti-racist politics stuff is this notion that, like I've often said, too many people try to treat this thing, right, this thing I've been calling now this sort of blob that occupies a cultural space that a left would occupy if there were one in the U.S. But to treat it like a threat, right, where like you gotta show that you have learned the Greek alphabet or whatever else you need to do before you become a member, right? And it shouldn't be. We spend too much time talking to people who agree with us already, and what we need to do is to concentrate on trying to build the solidarities. And I mean, especially if you've been around the labor movement for a while, and you come to see that people themselves can work that stuff out, right? And they can work out. And granted, like if you operate in a world in which you're expected to know what my pronoun is, right? And if you don't, then I cancel you, whatever that means, right? Well, no, we're not going to get anywhere. But ordinary people, if left to their own devices, particularly if they're yoked together in the pursuit of a common objective, like, I don't know, class power, will work that kind of stuff out among themselves, and they don't need Robin DiAngelo or anybody else at the stage, like an intervention to get them to do stuff, right? Well, a little confidence I can work. So I hope that's an adequate response to the question. Sorry. Yes, sir. Excuse me.
So I just have a question. And I ask this with all due respect. Is it possible to forge, you think, meaningful political allegiances if we continue to repeat or narrate the problem of race as black and white?
Yeah. Well, I'm not talking about erasure, right? I'm just saying that first of all, the first part of this talk, a punchline out was the race doesn't really explain anything. Right? So we can feel absolved, right, of the need to try to explain existing inequalities by reference to race. But again, I mean, insofar as there are differences that people consider meaningful, and look, I mean, I think, I don't believe the attitudes are fixed and given, right? I think they're socially constructed too. And I think that we have had, not to put too fine a point on it, but from one reckoning, Reagan, from another reckoning, Clinton, right? We've had a political environment for at least 30 years now, in which the Democrats or liberals or what people associate with being a left, right, has had absolutely nothing to offer working people as working people, right? But I just had, I had an encounter a couple of weeks ago. I was in a cab in Center City, Philadelphia, and the cab driver was like a young Sikh guy, right? He's a guy, seemed like he was in his 30s, well messed up, right? But we were chatting in the cab about life, about how long he has to wait for fares now, how long he's been out, what COVID has done, whether he's got a small kid who's in school. And then, of course, the conversation eventually turns to gas prices because we're not in Texas. So gas is like creeping up to $5 a gallon for us now. And the guy's lament was, Biden just doesn't seem to care about how people are suffering. And then he said that the only thing Biden seems to care about is making black people happy. And he didn't say it in a hostile way at all, right? It's not like he's ready to go burn crosses and affiliate everything, right? But it's just an observation that you can see a normal, not especially a political person making from watching stuff on the TV news and glancing at the newspaper. Right? So I said to him, you're not being judgmental in any way at all. Well, like, it's only rich black people Biden's trying to make happy because he doesn't care about black working people either. But I mean, the guy agreed. But I mention that because this is the perspective, right, that Trump and the right have been taking advantage of, right? And the more, what's supposed to be our side can't talk about anything except, I don't know, but I guess I say this too often, but, how many Oscars Ava DuVernay wins Best Picture? Or what the color of the new Supreme Court justice is. That just opens space for the nasty fascist right to try to agitate, right, about those issues. So what I'm saying actually is, I think the best way to attack existing questions of racial inequality or racial injustice is by trying to find or to broaden the base around shared concerns among people that have to work for them. So is that a response? Or is that okay?
Yeah.
Well, I mean clear, but I don't mean to say it's persuasive, but.
Yes, sir. I guess my only thing is that in almost all narratives, in almost all cases, we report racial injustices, racial camaraderie, racial reductionism, all these rhetorics about race, always revolve around the black and white kind of contrast.
Oh, okay.
Mexicans, Hispanics were kind of mentioned a bit in the Louisiana things. Asian Americans were never. It's as if in all these, I guess, in all these reportages, in all these narratives, some people are just not ever present.
Right. Well, so I apologize because I think I misunderstood the original question. And I'd say, now that I understand it more clearly, my Sikh cab driver that was part of his issue too, right? Here's a guy, and there's a significant Sikh population like in Upper Darby, just right next to Philly. So here's a guy who's out busting his ass trying to keep his family together and send his kid to school. And all he hears about, like in the news, is black, white, race, anti-race, right? I mean, whatever. But I think my response holds for that too, right? Because the vast majority of us, right? I mean, no matter how we cook our beans and rice, right? And I'm from a beans and rice culture, right? Are at the levels that matter concerned about the same issues. Right? And like we, in 2006, we actually, being the National Labor Party, won a ballot line for a South Carolina Labor Party. And what we had to do to get it was get more than 10,000 registered voters to sign a petition telling the Secretary of State that they need to recognize a Labor Party. And we got more than 16,000. And what a lot of people said, that when we were talking in flea markets, was it's about time that there's some political force or entity in South Carolina that actually wants to address the things that working people are concerned about. Right? We're going to get up in the morning and go to bed at night. Right? If you don't have a job, you want one. If you have one and it's decent, you want to keep it. If you have a shitty job, you want to get a better one. You want health care access, right? You want quality housing, right? Education for your kids and yourselves, right? For your family, access to it. And like those are the basic building blocks, right? Not fighting. I don't even know how one does this anyway. Well, I'm getting a picture of how one does it. But to close the wealth gap that once again exists between the richest 10% of black people and the richest 10% of white people, right? The vast majority of all of us, right? No matter what we do with our beans, it's not have a dog in that fight, right? Right, and that's among them. But then I'm really completely. I mean, and I've spent a lot of time in Chicago, and I still have a foot in Chicago politics. And I got to say, and Chuy Garcia, who was an old friend of mine, ran for mayor against Ronald. The way that the black political class sided with Ron Emanuel against him was disgusting. And it wasn't that they had a moral obligation, right, for black-brown alliance, but it just said something about how the class politics actually plays out. And we all need to be alive to it. Thanks again, and I apologize again for initially misinterpreting. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I had two questions. You said race doesn't explain anything regarding existing inequalities. Did I write that down? So the first question I have is, are you familiar with studies where they send a resume with an ethnic name on it versus a white name on it, and the employers will choose the white name even if the resumes are the same? That's my first question. And my second question is, I'm interested in, you mentioned how gender is also a construct, so you might know UT Dallas has a chess team. We don't have a football team, we have a chess team, and I'm interested in women in chess. And one of the things that's said about women in chess is they're not hardwired to play chess, they don't have the brains to play chess. And so my second question is, because obviously a lot of the same things are said about race in other realms, how do you combat people who talk about brain science and who only look at the current picture versus, which might be based on participation or interest, but they say it's not that, it's brains. So those are my two different questions, and I'm hoping you can address them. Thank you. Yeah,
sure. Well, and as luck might have it, I have something to say about each of them.
Yay!
On the first one, this makes me feel really good because a dissertation advisee of mine now, and in fact, one of the things I have to do now that I've gotten this talk out of the way is to read the draft of an article that she's resubmitting to a journal. It's based on a chapter of the dissertation. She's actually examined those field studies. And one of the things that she's found, and she's not the first person to find it, she's a political philosopher, so it's not like she's a big-time quantist. But that the names that drew the negative reaction were Arabic names. And the studies were done not that long after September 11th. So that kind of puts some more stuff in the game, right? Like it's not definitive, right? So I mean, that's that, at least for the moment. On the other stuff, So, there was a woman psychologist named Carol Gilligan.
Yeah, I'm familiar with
Yeah,
that.
well, I thought she might be. And like, she's kind of like, well, it's not entirely fair to either one of them, but I sometimes think of her as like the Booker T. Washington of the mismeasure of gender, right? Because she made the case for that so-called women's ways of knowing stuff. And damn it, I mean, I know this is a problem with American liberalism, and with so much of stuff that people do. But this inclination to believe that two people can say exactly the same thing, but the motives that they have for saying it makes the thing different, right? I mean, I remember this like from Moynihan, a report in the mid-'60s, and how black nationalists would get kind of tied up in knots about this, because they made the same arguments about pathological black culture that Moynihan made, but they wanted somehow to be correct when they made it and wrong when he made it. And like, I'll make another little plug here. Like, this is grappling with that kind of conundrum has been a motif that's run through my entire academic career. So a few years ago, this must have been 2015, after a week or two of watching Fulmination about people attacking Rachel Dolezal, by the woman who claimed to have been black, while at the same time lauding Caitlyn Jenner. And I kept waiting for somebody to try to make an argument, right, about how you can accept the one and denounce the other. And I never got that argument. And the more that I read, the closest thing you got to an argument that I saw was because they're not the same thing. Well, that's no argument, right? Rabbi, your mother would tell you when you're 5 years old, that's no damn argument. So I sat down at the kitchen table on a Sunday and I wrote an article about that point. But it's the same thing with the women's ways of knowing stuff, right? As Frederick Douglass said, you can't have the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. So the women's ways of knowing stuff is the exact equivalent of race science, right? It is race science, right? And like, especially if you think of race the way I've argued, you should think of it as one particular species, like within a genus of ideologies of naturalized hierarchy. And people, by the way, have done really good work on it. So an Australian woman named Cordelia, Fine, thank you. And a couple of others. But did Carol Pateman do something on this? Somebody else has. Fine's book isn't called Mismeasure of Gender, is it?
Illusions of Gender.
Yeah, well, somebody else did a book called Mismeasure of Gender. So, I mean, there is good work on that, but not there. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's something to say about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Adolph, can I get you to talk a little bit more about the implications for medical and public health practice? And one example that my students and I often talk about is gendered and racial differences in the way that sort of pain reports are received and pain management is done. But there's lots of examples.
Well, yeah, no, that's a good one. And there too, right? Yeah, I mean, if you go back to see, like I tend, like, once I start talking about Pansiak race theory, like I can kind of wander around in those corridors like for hours. So I had to stop myself here today. But part of the story, what was that? And this was like central to Lamarckian race theory, that women and the lower orders, right, didn't feel pain to the extent that upper status white men did. Because part of the story too, it was less an issue here, except for the eugenicists later on, but British race scientists were absolutely convinced that the English working class was racially different from the upper class, right? But the stereotypes are always the same, right? Right, the groups that they're applied to vary, but yeah, it's always the same. So that's clear. And a couple of years ago, but I know you read this stuff, and I'll bet a lot more about it than I do. But we began to see work showing how treatment logarithms, or rather algorithms, rehearsed presumptions of racial difference, but it was always, but it's not like David Duke or Charles Murray were sitting behind a curtain doing this. It was also always linked to profitability, right, and to keeping costs down. Right? So, for instance, one of them that comes to mind is that renal failure gets diagnosed much later in blacks than in whites typically. Why? Partly because in construction of the algorithm, black is a proxy for not having insurance. Right? So it's messy, right? The stuff is messy. And what that means is what we know that race is, like it's a shorthand, right? But it's a shorthand for making distinctions that are ultimately class distinctions, right? And that's what happens with a lot of cop stuff too. And I've said often that there's no question that the black Yale graduate investment banker is going to be several times more likely than his white classmate, who is also an investment banker, to get stopped by a cop and forced to lie down flat on a train platform, right? And in some cases, that difference, or the difference in vulnerability, would be an expression of an individual cop's bigotry. In some cases, though, it's going to be it's going to be expressive of a cop's faulty application of race as a shorthand for the kind of people who should be a suspect, and whom property should be protected from, right, basically. And you can tease this out a little bit more, because I think, I haven't seen the numbers, but I would bet real money on it, that black investment banker, in the course of his daily life, would be much less likely than a black or Latino or possibly even white person who lives in one of those zip codes that are targeted by stress policing techniques for housing the populations who are most likely to affront the concerns of people with property. Right. So again, like, it's back to the Fields' observation that what race does, especially like in the United States, is provide a surface camouflage, right, over class and political economic inequality. And then as the U.S. tries, through the social sciences and the foundations, tries to export this idea of the work that race does around the rest of the world, then you can see how it's even more insidious potential.
Earlier you said that after Katrina, the reason that people didn't come back to their houses was because the more black people's houses were destroyed than white people's.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you would say in regard to like analyses of environmental racism that say that black people are more likely to own homes in areas that are likely to be flooded or vulnerable to storm surge.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's true up to a point. But as you know, water's going to do what it's going to do, and it knows who lives where, right? And the wealthy Lakeview area, which is 90% white, and like the Republican stronghold in the city was flooded every bit as badly as the lower ninth ward was. And that's where, like, extent of damage also becomes kind of a complex consideration, right? Because to some extent, the extent of the damage is defined by the resources that you have to be able to address the damage too, right? But on the environmental racism thing, I got another story for you. It's a short one. Like this was around 2006, and again in South Carolina. I was at the convention like of another independent party in South Carolina, the UCP, United Citizens Party, that had been created by black Democrats in the late 60s, when the white Democrats in South Carolina didn't want them in the regular Democratic Party. And what the delegates at the convention were doing, I was just there as an observer, was they were trying to put together the platform for elections that year. And one of the issues was a toxic dump and brownfield problem in a county, I forget which of the counties it was. Right? And there were several women, older women mainly, black and white, but predominantly black, who were from that county and were there to press this issue. And they proposed that it be defined as an environmental justice issue. There was a black guy there, he was kind of a South Carolina version of Duvalier, was a politician. He'd been disgraced and spent some time in jail. He got out of jail and was trying to run for office to get his good name back. And he was there with his minions. And it's clear that being a racial justice warrior was going to be his route to getting his name back. So he and his minions argued vociferously that it should be defined as environmental racism. Right? The women from the county fought him tooth and nail, and like their argument was, well, it's not just black people; it's people who live in this area, right? And it's poor people; it's people who can't afford to live places where they're not subject to stuff like this. So, and I know the way. In fact, I thought about this when I mentioned that example, or the example in the talk. That there's a way that you can keep unraveling the onion, right? To argue that, well, yeah, it's not racism in the most proximate sense, right? And there's no one actively discriminating. But the fact that black people are more likely to live when they are, the fact that they're more likely to live in neighborhoods that flood or that are subject to toxic degradation is evidence of racism in the past. Well, maybe, but you can't act on it in that way, right? Like unless your politics is all about some notion of reparative justice, which is problematic, I think, in other ways too. But yeah, I mean, you can just as easily see the greater likelihood. Well, not just as easily. I shouldn't be caught. It's more. It's a sharper explanation to see the fact that black people are more likely to live in these areas of either flood or be subject to toxic degradation as a function of them not having the resources to live in some places that are more secure than to call it, or as is to call it racism, and I think it's more direct to call it the former. And it also kind of points to a remedy, right? And so this is another problem that I have with anti-racist or race reductionist politics, is that the point is never really to get to an explanation that gives a remedy. But the point is only to identify the name by which you should call the injustice, the label you should put on the injustice. Right? So in that sense, I don't think environmental racism helps us, but I take your point.
We've got a question from the online audience.
Yeah.
Matt Carson asks, do you think that race and racism is more about creating a false consciousness or white identity to prop up capitalism, or is it about creating material incentives to promote capitalist stability? What do you think is sort of functional?
Yeah, well, yeah, I get concerned about going too far down the road of functions account. What I tend to think of it more as a product of like the open-ended on the historical processes, right? And if you look at the 17th century origins of the race idea in British North America, you see, like it took a long time, and the notions bubble up and they get codified here and there. Labor market conditions change. The word gets out back to England that conditions were really harsh for indentured servants, right over here, especially after the Anglo-Virginian bourgeoisie came to define itself as an indigenous governing class. They could still get them from Ireland because nobody gave a shit about the Irish anyway, right? Pardon me for saying the S word. So it like evolves, right? Over time, there's a commonsensical quality to it. But that said, if you look at the late 19th century, right? The planter, merchant, capitalist class in the former Confederacy had lived with like 3 decades of anxiety after emancipation about this problem of blacks, especially once black men were enfranchised, and the lower orders of whites aligning to challenge their political power. I thought for a long time, but those fears were exaggerated. We can look at how Elon Musk today equates having to pay taxes with the forced march to Treblinka, right? To get a sense of just how touchy the governing class can be about anything that seems like it might challenge their prerogatives anyway, whatsoever. But at the same time, it's also the case that there were successful challenges, at least for a time, right? The readjustment movement in Virginia, and the big one, but other stuff more locally, like fighting over, school fundings, right, or local taxes, or whatever, fencing laws. With the big one being the populist uprising, like in the early 1890s. Once that's put down violently, right, next thing that happens is disfranchisement. And so you take blacks out of the political equation, and then you impose the Jim Crow order, right? That's an explicitly racially codified system of hierarchy. The former governor or the governor of North Carolina at the time, was justified by saying the Democratic Party is all we need, and we need the strength that comes from thinking alike. And that we was white people, but he didn't have to say it because they were saying it all the time. So in that sense, it certainly functioned that way. But as Walter Ben Michaels and I have been arguing, and I'll toss out a plug for our forthcoming book, that's a collection of mainly of published articles by each of us and a couple together, and a long conversation, more than 100 pages. And the title of it is No Politics but Class Politics. But one point we've been making along the way is that the work that racism did in obscuring political economy and class dynamics in the late 19th century, anti-racism as a class program does now. So,
any other questions? Time for one more, I think. Yeah.
I just had a question about the recent organizing of Amazon, and at least my understanding, part of why that was so successful is that Amazon was pretty overt about making a racist appeal around, Chris Smalls is not trying to center him, saying he's not very intelligent, which is your coded appeal and so on, and that sort of the workers sort of reacted in solidarity against that, and that was part of why the pushback was so huge. I guess what sort of, and I haven't read deeply, so that may just be one version of the story I've heard, but I was wondering what lessons you may have drawn from that organizing.
Well, actually, there's some friends of mine and I have been going back and forth about this question a little bit, just trying to, the basic observation is it's too soon to offer any explanations, right, about, but right, because there are two sides to this, right? The Staten Island group won the vote by about 10% margin. And last I heard, like the Bessemer, Alabama group was like down by about a 6% margin, but they're still like greater than that margin number of votes were contested. So who knows what's going to happen? But my sense is, and look, I mean, yeah, there were so many reasons not to like the left internet. So many, so many. But one of them is the rush to be the firstest with the smartest, right? And that's either the first to explain the victory or the first to explain the defeat and who sold it out, right, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot. Right, and most of the tropes that I've seen so far, just from sampling, the hyperbolic explanations, just seem too simplistic, right? It's rank and file led strategy versus sclerotic trade union bureaucracy. Yeah, you're right. But the one thing that I do know, and this doesn't undercut or gainsay anything else, but one thing we know for sure is that the Staten Island campaign occurred in a state with 22% union density, right? And right next to a state with 17% union density. So like these, and like Staten Island is like, like in the water between Jersey and New York State. But the one thing we know is that 1 in 4 of those workers has either been in a union himself or herself, has friends and family members who have been in unions, and operates in a political system, right, that reflects the institutionalization of, 80 years of victories of CIO trade unionism, right? With state labor rules, right, and judges, right, and friendly cops, and all the rest of that. I got arrested during the Taj Mahal strike in Atlantic City, and I should be embarrassed to call it arrested, right? Because the police union was about to go out on strike themselves, and they were really friendly, and they booked us in the Miss America amphitheater because they thought it would take too long to process us through the police station. When the cafeteria workers at the Yale were out on strike like in the mid-'80s, at the police union, which was also like a key player in the local labor council, right, was very supportive, right? And even those, the apartheid or the anti-apartheid demonstrators. And the other campaign was in Bessemer, Alabama. And, Bessemer, Alabama is in Alabama. And it's like the opposite end of a union-friendly, right, universe or context. So I'm sure that when the definitive story is written, right, that institutional or that difference in institutional location is going to have to be a big part of the story. But a problem is, I understand this. I mean, but like I've always said to students and stuff that if you want to be active in left politics, you got to start thinking like a Major League Baseball player, where if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you go to the Hall of Fame. Because, and especially in working class politics, because you're going to lose a lot more than you win, right? And for whatever flavor of the left in the U.S., it's been really bleak for decades or so. So I understand the impulse to want to find stuff to get happy about, right? And the impulse to find stuff to get happy about, though, is like also feeds the impulse of like being the firstest and the smartest, but the first one to see that the apparent victory was really a failure, or the apparent failure was really a victory, or to ask questions and antagonistically, like why didn't Bernie Sanders win the nomination? Well, who thought Bernie Sanders was going to win the damn nomination anyway? Right. So I mean, that's all to say. It's a really interesting development. It's kind of reassuring to know that things aren't over, like in Alabama yet. Apparently, unless you guys throw some I had. But it's way too easy to make way too much of an isolated incident like this. I appreciate the question.
All right, please join me in thanking Just a few quick announcements. We do like to have books for sale outside.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Copies at the South. So if you're interested, just pick up a copy. If you're interested in joining our mailing list, we've got a sign-up sheet over here for the Center for Values.
Please leave your best email. That doesn't necessarily mean you the last email, okay, the one that you check, or you are not afraid things are getting lost somewhere in the abyss of, you know.
And then we have another lecture next Friday in the same room, right?
Yes, in the same room.
The Crisis of Trust in Science and Other Myths.
And the information is on the
flyer.
So, yeah, is there a way I can...
That's going to be on YouTube as well.
Yeah, okay.
We'll get you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you all.